It should not go unstated that much of human flourishing and human well-being has come at the expense of non-human nature. There are many fewer wild animals on the planet than there were a century or two ago. So I don't want to deny that a trade-off between human and natural well-being exists. What I do want to deny is that it's possible to revert to a pre-modern setting.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. The first thing I wanted to do is give our listeners a sense of where you're coming from. You not long ago wrote this as a list of some of your defining convictions, which I thought summed up your worldview pretty well. The government should fund technology policy. Nuclear energy is good, not bad. Economic growth can drive positive sum improvements for humans and nature. Environmental activists are kind of full of it. Well, I was wondering if you could flesh out each element of that credo. First, how can economic growth benefit both humans and nature?
So, the umbrella statement I would make is that sort of post-war American environmentalism makes a bunch of big mistakes in terms of how to conceptualize nature and humans' relationship to it. And in doing so, it sort of defines nature as fragile and delicate and sort of and in a sort of one-to-one trade-off between sort of the well-being of the natural world and the well-being of the human world, and human economic growth and sort of human technological invasion of nature. It was the sort of founding premise of environmental pushback to industrial development, to economic growth, to population growth, and the sort of...
So here you're talking about, just when you're thinking about the early 1960s, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the idea that we're slowly being poisoned and that this immense material prosperity has this dark side of basically destroying all that is beautiful and bucolic in our world.
Exactly. And you can understand sort of why that happened. So think about the sort of post-war era in the United States. First of all, you just had not the first, but the second of a global, highly industrialized war where you had the introduction of previously unimaginable technologies and sort of unimaginable sort of perversions of what we thought about as natural in the splitting of the atom, but not just the splitting of the atom, and the invention of organochlorine pesticides to replace sort of organic pesticides. And sort of increasingly sort of disruptive ways of thinking about humanity's relationship with non-human nature, not to mention just unprecedented scale. The rate of global population growth had never, ever in the history of humanity been higher than it was in the 30 years after World War II. The rate of land use change had never been greater. And in that sense, sort of post-war American environmentalism is a kind of reactionary political force against sort of industrialization and against growth and against specific new classes of technology, nuclear power, hydroelectric dams, industrial fertilizers and pesticides. And you can sort of understand why that happens.
So there's this anti-energy impulse, but also there's this anti-urban impulse. That's part of it, right? I mean, there's this connection between, the idea of a love of nature, thinking about the desire to preserve endangered species and what have you, the idea that we want to keep nature pristine.
Really, there's a sort of, as you put it, bucolic template for what nature is. And it's rolling hills and low productivity farms and forests in the background. And it's not sort of density in our cities. It's not high tech. It's not sort of modern and industrial. These things were antithetical to the environmentalist imaginary as it was posited in the sort of founding of environmentalism. And again, there were sort of reasons for that. Pollution, land use change, sort of over application of chemical pesticides and fertilizers were worsening problems in this era. This was when ozone pollution was getting much worse. That rivers and aquifers were getting both depleted and contaminated. And so there were good reasons for what ultimately came out of the founding of the environmental movement, like the Clean Air Act, like the Clean Water Act. The problem was the sort of luggage they carried with them, which was this sort of anti-high energy, anti-technology and anti-industrial, and in many cases sort of, like you say, anti-urban tendencies that I think a lot of modern sort of environmentalists in 2023 would like to pretend are not still with us in the environmental movement, but I would say very much are.
So basically, when you're thinking about your own environmentalism, I'm curious. I mean, when you first came to these issues, when you first started studying them, do you feel as though you came out of that, call it romantic tradition of environmentalism that, is deeply invested in the idea of a kind of untouched nature?
Very much so. And I think I found my way out of it due to just a sort of unavoidable sense of cognitive dissonance. I was a sort of, in college especially, a young sort of conventional romantic environmentalist who was concerned about economic growth and overconsumption and consumerism specifically. And I imagined myself in a lineage with the sort of protest movement and the civil rights movements that had been that were started to be emulated by the sort of modern climate movement. So this was in the late aughts, early 2010s, when you had sort of the early climate marches and sort of organizing for climate action, including specific climate policy in Congress. At the same time, I was I had gone to sort of middle school and high school in the Bay Area, where I was sort of acutely aware of both the environmental efficiency and sustainability of urban density, but also the sort of joy and human flourishing that can happen in a highly urbanized, highly industrialized, in many ways dematerialized society. And also the Bay Area, one of the wealthiest places, not just on the planet, but in human history, right? So I was sort of grappling with an environmental ideal that was sort of, again, low energy, sort of bucolic, rural in its imaginary, sort of low technology, low consumption, while I was and my peers were living anything but that lifestyle. And so I think that's part of the cognitive dissonance that led me away from the sort of conventional environmental imaginary to what we now call eco-modernism, which you sort of summed up a little bit at the top of our conversation, which pictures technology, growth, sort of even industrialization of the landscape as ways to more efficiently use Earth's resources and to actually spare more of nature and pollute less of it.
Alex, I wonder if you could talk to us a bit more about the eco-modernist thesis and the idea that economic growth can be positive sum for human development and for nature. Because, there is this classic environmental view that, what you're doing is rejecting this inescapable trade-off, and that what you need to do is embrace this kind of ascetic morality in which you're rejecting materialism, you're rejecting this form of abundance that I imagine to a conventional environmentalist, the view would be this is kind of an illusion, and that ultimately we need to renounce certain kinds of consumption, and that overconsumption is the kind of grave evil. That is not your perspective as I understand it. So I'm curious, what do you say to those classic environmentalists who say that, look, the problem is people flying in jets. The problem is people, consuming more housing, more heat, more energy than people in the developing world who are so much poorer?
So there is a trade-off. It should not go unstated that much of human flourishing and human well-being has come at the expense of non-human nature. There are many fewer wild animals on the planet than there were a century or two or three ago. We've converted more than half of the ice-free land on Earth for some form of human use, and that's mostly sort of farmland and grazing land for food production, but also production forests and other uses. Look, if you could go back 3 or 4 centuries to when there were fewer than a billion people on the planet and make a choice, like if we want to preserve non-human nature, we have a choice. We can either invent steam engines and internal combustion engines and capture nitrogen from the atmosphere for our fertilizers, split the atom and create jet turbines, or we can do none of that, and we can sort of remain a pre-modern society, and in doing so save nature. Then that would have worked. The sort of aesthetic concept would work to save nature. That's why we call it eco-modernism. We're describing an environmentalism for a modern and postmodern reality, which is inescapable, actually. So I don't want to deny that a trade-off between human and natural well-being exists. What I do want to deny is that it's possible to revert to a pre-modern setting, or that winding back the clock at all is in fact nature saving. It's not, especially at this point. What economic growth mostly is doing is moving towards dematerialization by using both sort of supply side and demand side resources more efficiently. It's moving the sort of bulk of humanity away from sort of large scale materials and energy intensive labor, whether that's in agriculture and manufacturing or things like that, towards sort of service industries like you and I are engaged in. What we see, especially over the last century or so, is declining per capita land area required to produce food. So I, as a omnivore in 2023, use like 30% as much land to produce my diet as I would have 300 years ago. We use less per capita timber and sort of lithium and silicon for our consumption. We use less coal per capita than we did a century ago in the United States, even though we are almost an order of magnitude wealthier. And so those are the trends that, especially again, in 2023, in a sort of modern and postmodern setting, we want to see accelerated. We want to see further intensification of food and energy production so that we're using less land and less sort of materials from less natural resources for improving human well-being. We want to see the continued sort of dematerialization of economic activity. So those are the ways in which.
So Alex, perhaps one way to think about this is a kind of curve in which you are as you achieve increased economic growth, there's this period of time when you're consuming more and more resources, but then you pass some curve where you achieve a requisite level of affluence and productivity where you're actually seeing this shift towards less resource intensive economic growth. Is that a fair characterization of how you see it shaking out?
Mostly. Part of it is a kind of Kuznets curve where you do see a sort of spike in the material or energy or land use intensity of human consumption of natural resources. But another part of it is just there's many, many more humans today than there were 100, 200, certainly 300 years ago. And that is a huge explanation for why the aggregate impact of human consumption has gone up, because in many
even
cases,
as the per capita consumption goes down. Yep.
Yes, because in some cases, per capita consumption of resources went up. Like we weren't consuming that much lithium 150 years ago, and obviously consumption of lithium has spiked and become more efficient only in recent decades. But the land intensity of human diets has been on a pretty steady downward trend on a per capita basis, and that includes that's inclusive of us eating higher up the food chain, eating things like chicken and beef at more prevalent rates. The land intensity of our diet has been declining for centuries, eons, really. And the reason that we use more land for farming today is mostly because there's 8 billion of us. And even so, the land area to produce food hasn't actually really grown over the last 2 decades, even as there are almost 2 billion more people on the planet in that time, as we've become more efficient at producing food. So it is a couple things. One is we get more efficient at producing well-being goods for humans to consume, food, materials, shelter, and there's an aggregate effect in addition to a per capita one. The growth rate of the human population is slowing. No one really knows when it's going to stabilize or start to decline, but everyone expects that to happen sometime by the end of the century. That might reverse in the next century or something. I don't want to say what will or should happen there, but the aggregate effect is important to remember here too.
So we've been talking about post-war environmentalism and that sensibility, how eco-modernism represents an alternative to that sensibility, drawing on your understanding of the relationship between economic development and resource consumption. One big change when you're looking at the challenges and controversies and problems that post-war environmentalists were focused on to modern environmentalists is the issue of climate. This idea that climate change represents an immediate, urgent, grave threat, and that this necessitates a very big, dramatic change in human consumption patterns and much else. Now, I'll just stipulate that there is a wide array of opinions on these issues, certainly among the folks who listen to this program. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. So one view is that the atmospheric concentration of carbon is an issue that is having real, immediate, pressing effects on the world, and that means that we're in the face of what some folks call a climate emergency, an emergency that necessitates really dramatic changes in how we organize human affairs. Curious to hear your reaction to that, how you think about how climate discourse has changed environmentalism and about this rhetoric of climate emergency.
There's a funny sort of disjointed nature to the conventional framing of the climate problem coming out of environmentalism, and that's to say that climate change is a problem sort of similar to acid rain from sulfur emissions, or the ozone problem, or deforestation, or sort of pollution from coal plants. Problems that the sort of environmental movement was sort of created to solve in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And
can you elaborate on that? So those are problems that are pretty well defined, and where I'm curious, when you think about those problems, what do you see them having in common?
Yeah, so I mean, like we were talking about a little bit at the top, environmentalism is sort of a social movement largely founded in wealthy countries, standing athwart industrial development, yelling stop. They're looking at highways, they're looking at coal plants, they're looking at hydroelectric dams, they're looking at nuclear power plants, they're looking at industrialized agricultural systems, and we're saying this is too high tech, this is causing too high a supply of food, of energy, it's changing our lifestyles, we're becoming far too consumerist, and it's causing too much pollution. And so you invent regulations to cut back on smog coming from cars, and on sulfur and noxious emission coming out of coal plants, and you sort of invent this sort of conservation, the post-war conservation movement, focused on preservation of natural areas. And you come up with the whole organic farming movement, which doesn't use sort of industrial pesticides and fertilizers and genetically modified organisms. And these are in many ways successful. Smog pollution is way down over the last couple of decades. So sulfur emissions from coal plants is way down. Air pollution generally is down. The problem is that these solutions were sort of tinkering on the edges of industrial modernity. You were able to install sort of scrubber technologies on coal smokestacks to reduce sulfur emissions. You were able to invent and then require the use of catalytic converters in personal vehicles, which dramatically cut down on the ozone coming out of cars that contributes to smog. So you're
not saying no personal vehicles. You're saying, hey, let's have this, this little device, this little tweak of a familiar technology, and that will yield these very significant gains.
Right, which is exactly why climate change is, I think, is not suited to the kinds of solutions that traditional environmentalism was invented to solve, and in many cases successfully did solve. Climate change is caused by emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. These are sort of carbon is a fundamental building block to all of life on Earth and to the atmosphere. It is not a sort of trace side effect of industrial modernity like organochlorine pesticides or like sulfur emissions coming out of a coal plant. Carbon is the source of fuel in coal, in oil, in natural gas. And so replacing it or dealing with the climate problem is not tinkering on the edges of industrial modernity. It is fully turning over all of industrial modernity, every power plant, every factory, every vehicle, and while also sort of maintaining a standard of living that I think is overwhelmingly obvious everybody on Earth basically wants, especially including environmentalists. who are overwhelmingly some of the wealthiest people on the planet today and some of the wealthiest people to ever walk the earth. So at the same time as you have this claim that climate change is just like any old pollution problem, and we need to regulate it, and we need to sort of cut back on consumption. You have this claim that it is fundamentally different from other problems. This global emergency that we have to do something drastic to confront. But the only sort of specificity you get when you ask about the sort of drastic response is, we need to sort of regulate carbon emissions, or we need to sort of voluntarily cut back on consumption. And I think that there's just sort of a disjointedness and a really sort of unsatisfying problem definition and set of proposed solutions that again sort of caused me quite a bit of cognitive dissonance in my youth and led me towards eco-modernism in the first place.
Well, this is fascinating, Alex, because in a way, you're describing how deeply embedded carbon, living in these kind of high energy societies, how interlaced that is with our prosperity, with our way of life, with so many things that we, love and appreciate about living in an affluent society that creates so many opportunities for so many. So one takeaway from that is, call it the Greta Thunberg position, which is that, well, the problem is industrial modernity. The problem is high consumption, and that is something we need to renounce. And it seems that eco-modernism is going in a different direction, and it's saying, well, actually, a high energy society, a high energy way of life is not a bad thing. So then how do you, it seems like these are very different directions you could go in, both from the takeaway that, hey, if you want a certain kind of, prosperous way of life, it really is, certainly for now, bound up with a kind of carbon intensive way of life.
It's particularly frustrating that the sort of specific practical solutions offered often by sort of the Greta Thunberg style of environmentalism are things like, we need to go all organic with our food production, or we need to do 100% wind, water, and hydroelectric power in our energy system. Those are things that cause, in many cases, bigger environmental impacts than the conventional technologies. 100% wind, water, solar energy system would obviously cut down on carbon emissions. These are renewable energy technologies. They don't burn carbon to produce energy, but they would triple or quadruple or more the land footprint of the energy system. When you imagine all of the solar farms and wind farms and transmission lines you would need to build in order to run a system just on these technologies, which is why Breakthrough has such a big focus, not an exclusive one, but a big one on nuclear energy. Similarly, if we actually tried to feed 8 going on 9 or 10 billion people using just sort of organic and especially sort of small scale organic farming practices and technologies, the footprint of global food consumption wouldn't double, but it would go up. It would get worse, not better. And so that's a particularly sort of frustrating thing about trying to sort of port conventional sort of environmentalist imaginaries onto the climate problem, because in many cases they would make the problem worse.
But Alex, there is a way to reconcile this, right? Which is that, one way to put it is that, on the one hand, you have this idea of degrowth. The idea that, Greta Thunberg, let's say we take her worldview seriously, and let's say we take the challenge of environmental sprawl seriously and all of the different issues that you've raised, and the environmental costs of that. The way out of that dilemma is to say we should have a radically smaller human population, right? I mean, and you could say that is a serious position to say that it should all be solar, wind, and batteries and what have you. We should reject the high energy way of life. And then the other serious position is eco-modernism. So in a way, these are mirror images of each other. And the problem, perhaps, is this mushy middle between degrowth and eco-modernism, where you're pretending that we could have something like our, affluent kind of urban way of life, and yet embrace the Thunberg-style solutions. Is that a fair characterization in your view, that actually, in a way, degrowth and eco-modernism are the only positions that are reconciling with the trade-offs at work?
In a sense, I agree, at least at the conceptual level. Although, again, many of the goals of sort of card-carrying degrowthers, like moving towards a lower total human population, or reducing the material intensity of human consumption. These are things that are happening. The material intensity of human consumption is going down as we grow economically and become more resource efficient. The global population is trending, or the growth of global population is trending downwards as human societies become wealthier, as prospective parents are asking themselves, do I want a bigger family or a smaller one? Overwhelmingly, when societies get wealthier, they choose smaller families, both because the opportunity cost of having another kid is so much higher, and because the sort of labor benefit of having another kid is so much lower. So the very trends that degrowthers and sort of conventional environmentalists aim to aspire towards, lower population, lower material intensity, these are things that are happening in a growing economy.
Alex, what exactly is it that climate hawks are offering people on a tangible level?
You know, in many ways, I consider the sort of modern climate hawk offer to be very cool and inspiring. You know, they're talking about electric vehicles and, you know, really cool Teslas with insane mode that go crazy fast and look awesome. They're talking about, sort of really modern, sleek induction stoves that do like heat up your food faster than a gas or electric resistance stove would. They're talking about sort of electric heat pumps, which both heat and cool your house for sort of lower operational costs than a gas furnace would. The problem, I think, is that all of these sort of technologies are luxury goods today. A induction stove costs about twice as much as a gas stove. A electric heat pump costs I've seen between $10,000 and $20,000, even $30,000 for the machine and installation. We have a shortage of electricians in this country. Electric vehicles remain much more expensive than conventional internal combustion engine vehicles, and are actually getting worse right now, especially as the sort of supply chain bottlenecks on lithium and on battery materials make manufacturing profitable fleets of electric vehicles at scale really challenging. And as auto manufacturers have pushed towards bigger batteries and bigger cars, that has also pushed prices for electric vehicles up. So in the very long term, I think many of these technologies are, if not the future, then a significant part of our sort of residential and consumer lifestyle. But at the moment, these are a pretty bourgeois set of techno-futuristic consumer choices that were being sold as if they are affordable and easy to get in all cases. And if you just read the sort of interviews with people who try to get a heat pump installed in New York City or in Berkeley, California, where I am, and at the same time as making these technologies seem more available and cheaper than they are in reality, we're being told that the sort of technologies that we have today are poisoning us and our children. And that's what I worry about is a bunch of sort of climate hawks teaching their kids that the gas stove that their friends' parents still have is like smoking a pack of cigarettes every day. That just creates unnecessary sort of psychic weight on families, on kids, and makes it difficult to have these conversations and actually have civil and sort of iterative and constructive conversations about policy when there is so much sort of tech boosterism and sort of catastrophism happening at the same time with the climate hawk offer as such.
Alex, my instinct on environmental policy is just this. Every problem gets easier to solve when people get richer. And one of the best ways to make people richer is to ensure that energy is abundant and cheap. What would you say is wrong with that perspective? Because I will say that it biases me towards thinking that instead of trying to shut down hydrocarbon energy, we should, generally speaking, embrace it. Cleaner is better than dirtier. That's certainly true. Nuclear has massive advantages. But as a general matter, if hydrocarbon energy is making people richer, that's a good thing when it comes to making our societies more resilient and more adaptable. So what am I missing here?
Certainly, not only does more energy abundance make people wealthier and better off, but energy scarcity, even sort of marginal energy scarcity like we experienced in the sort of gasoline quasi-shortages of 2021 and 2022, make people very insecure. And in that sense, I am with you. Sort of hydrocarbon development for oil and gas especially remains, I think, a pretty important part of a energy policy posture, where we notably, like I mentioned before, we have sort of record fossil fuel production in this country right now, while also having record investments in low carbon technologies. These are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they might be tied to each other, because I think the Biden administration knows that if it, for instance, cracked down on oil and gas drilling on public lands in a really concerted way, that would have the intended effect of driving up prices of oil and gas and making it very unlikely that the Biden administration gets reelected to sustain its Inflation Reduction Act investments in low carbon technologies. I think that's going to remain the case for a much longer period of time than people would prefer, and I think part of that is because oil and gas jobs are good ones. When you build a sort of fracking rig, obviously there's a big sort of introduction of capital and engineering initially, but that rig will produce oil and jobs with it for decades. Which is why you have sort of fossil fuel based economies all over the country and all over the world today, in not quite the same way that you'll have clean energy-based economies. Clean energy is dematerializing. If we had 100% sort of wind, nuclear, solar, hydrogen grid sometime by later this century, it'll produce much less pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and use fewer material resources compared to fossil fuel production. But part of the challenge of that is that the sort of local benefits of natural resources production will be lower. In many ways, this is good for the earth and for sort of human productivity as we move towards sort of higher value labor, just like we do in other productivity enhancing improvements in the economy. But that's why this transition is so hard, is because fossil fuels remain extremely valuable and extremely useful, which and not just for sort of people who are employed in the industries, but for everybody who depends on cheap, abundant energy on a planet that still gets over 85% of its energy from fossil fuels. So that's sort of my response. We need energy abundance for a industrial and sort of post-industrial modern society. We can electrify, a bunch of it right now, but not most of it. And so assuring affordable, abundant energy will include a good amount of oil and gas for a long time.
So I wonder, when you're talking about this rhetoric of climate emergency, it has been incredibly inspiring to many people, especially many young people. And an important part of it is the idea that there are thresholds that we do not want to pass. So let's stipulate that, currently the world is, say, 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. And there is this view that if we pass 1.5, or if we passed 2 degrees, then suddenly we're at this point of no return. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about that idea, because my understanding is that you, Alex, and your colleagues at the Breakthrough Institute reject that idea that there are somehow these thresholds where we need to really take aggressive action. You see more of a continuum, as I understand it.
Better is better than worse. less warming is better than more warming. That has actually been very clear in the sort of atmospheric sciences for decades. The temperature thresholds, which you accurately point to as widely used in both the sort of scholarly literature around climate change and in sort of activist organizing and in sort of popular definitions of climate risk, are political and sort of institutional choices. In fact, the 2-degree threshold was sort of invented out of thin air by an economist in the 1970s before much sort of atmospheric climate science had been done in the first place, long before climate change was sort of a household issue. So I think it's actually sort of not a controversial view at all in the scientific literature that that climate change is not a problem of threshold; it's a problem of degrees, and more warming creates more energy in the atmosphere, which heats the oceans and affects extreme weather and natural disasters. And you want less of that, not more of it. But there are no sort of bright lines in the global temperature record beyond which there are sort of step changes in the risk profile of climate change. And my colleagues at Breakthrough have looked at this question of so-called tipping points, not just in sort of atmospheric climate warming, but in a whole bunch of sort of global climatic trends. And for the most part, we do not see any tipping points.
Well, tell us a bit more about. So, is it the idea that once you pass some threshold, then suddenly that is going to cause catastrophic effects? It's kind of like a 0-1 thing. You kind of pass that number, and then suddenly the Labrador current gets knocked out, or something like that. Is that what you mean by this idea of tipping points?
That is how it has been used. Yes, the idea that once you pass a certain global temperature threshold, then you're talking about sort of maybe collapsing the Atlantic current, or maybe in many sort of geographies around the world breaching the sort of what's called the wet bulb temperature, which is the temperature beyond which human bodies can sort of comfortably be outside. And we are seeing sort of increased precipitation. We are seeing increased heat and heat waves. But what we're also seeing over the last sort of century or so is a absolute, not just per capita, but an absolute decline in the vulnerability to extreme weather and natural disasters, and an absolute decline in the casualties caused by natural disasters. That increased security and increased safety from extreme weather and natural disasters is caused by, the very thing that is causing the problem in the first place in many ways, which is sort of industrial infrastructure, and as well as sort of softer technologies like early warning systems and flood barriers and things like that. So that's sort of my response when people talk about tipping points and sort of climate risk, as well as the absolute risks themselves. We are not an unadaptive species, and I don't want to say our capacity to adapt to climate risk is infinite. In fact, I and everyone who works at Breakthrough has sort of dedicated our careers towards trying to figure out how to reduce climate risk, and to reduce the emissions causing climate change to as close to zero as possible as soon as possible. But for all those reasons, it's not a threshold problem, and we so far appear to be adapting to many of the problems posed by our climate that have always been posed by our climate. For all those reasons, I think it's hard and really sort of unhelpful, both scientifically and from a political standpoint, to classify climate change as an emergency.
I suppose one characterization is that this use of these thresholds is meant to raise alarm bells, motivate political action, motivate these kinds of policies that might arrest further increases in carbon emissions. And it seems that your view is that actually this can actually be counterproductive insofar as rising affluence can also improve our ability to adapt. Is that a fair characterization? Talk us through that a bit. Just the usefulness of this rhetoric of emergency versus what you might call a more sober approach.
Yeah, I possibly go back and forth on how counterproductive I find the use of sort of thresholds-based climate science or climate communications to be, overwhelmingly because I think that climate change is emergent from our socio-technical economic system. I don't think that, despite sort of claims by prominent politicians to the contrary, we are not really making decisions based on these temperature targets, based on these atmospheric temperature targets. So I hesitate to say that they are strongly counterproductive. We are growing our economy. We are investing in low carbon energy. We are continuing to use fossil fuels, even though many sort of climate activists say that we need to somehow stop doing that entirely immediately. And those fossil fuels are still, in many cases, increasing our adaptivity and resilience to climate change. I do think that describing climate change as a sort of thresholds-based emergency is, once again, scientifically inaccurate, and I think we, as sort of responsible members of polite society and elite society, should avoid being scientifically inaccurate where we can. And I think it is more often than not demobilizing, sort of demobilizing and not sort of generative for thinking of ways to solve the problem.
Just to be more explicit about that, when you say demobilizing, what you mean is that it can create a sense of paralysis and despair, the sense that all is doomed and therefore, we should not seek constructive change. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, and once again, I wouldn't want to sort of diagnose climate catastrophism as the source of all of our sort of postmodern social anxiety in the world. I certainly would not go that far. For that, you would have to talk to an expert in sort of social media, in consumption in kids or something. I'm not sure, but I do think that to the extent that sort of social anxiety, rates of depression are increasing, which I think they are in many developed economies, those sort of rates of anxiety and depression easily latch very often on to claims of impending climate apocalypse. And I think that's, again, maybe not a central phenomenon in our sort of culture, but I do think it is at least a worrying one on the margins. And I do think that you see very unhelpful and really sort of in many cases sort of destructive ways of describing the climate problem, especially when you're talking about sort of teaching it to kids and embedding these ascientific catastrophist framings of the problem into sort of education.
I want to float an idea by you, Alex. What if you were to argue that there is such a thing as excessively rapid decarbonization? You noted earlier on that when you're thinking about extreme weather events, there's good reason to believe there's significant evidence that rising affluence can protect people from the ravages of extreme weather events and what have you. And even, let's leave aside extreme weather events, just, rising temperatures. When you're looking at the southeastern United States, when you're looking at Southeast Asia, these are places that have experienced rapid economic growth and the proliferation of air conditioning and other technologies that allow people to adapt. So, could you make the case that if you decarbonize too rapidly, the hit to economic growth in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, these places are such that actually you're preventing them from getting rich enough to actually deal with any number of natural hazards that people are faced with right now, even before temperatures get hotter. I wonder, because that seems like an argument that can kind of fit an eco-modernist framework, the idea that actually you don't want to push it too far too fast if the upshot of that is people are going to be too poor to actually deal with even the environmental challenges we face right now.
You're exactly right to mention places like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, because those are both the places that are sort of the poorest regions in the world today. Largely due to that level of poverty, the most vulnerable, not just to the effects of climate change, but to the effects of the climate. They're vulnerable to drought and to extreme weather, and to floods in ways that those of us who are fortunate enough to live in rich countries are not. So I don't worry too much about, as you put it, sort of overly rapid decarbonization in places like the United States, because I don't think that we will let it happen. We are sort of a modern, wealthy, mostly sort of small d democratic society. And if we try to sort of force low carbon technologies on communities that are not ready for them, or sort of mandate low carbon technologies that we don't have the sort of capacity to produce yet. Like, for instance, if we mandated that everyone drive an electric car by 2035, as California has done, I just don't expect that to happen. That's why the mandates are always like 10 years down the road.
You expect there would be a fierce political backlash to that?
At most, I would expect there to be a fierce political backlash to things like trying to shut down every fossil fuel plant and every sort of fossil fueled factory in America, which is why U.S. fossil fuel production, despite a decade or more of claims of climate emergency, U.S. fossil fuel production peaked at a record high this year. But for the most part, I think we just sort of set these targets, these sort of quasi mandates so far in the future that we will never actually have to be held accountable for them. Now, where I can and do see too rapid decarbonization, it is in wealthy countries' posture towards human development and industrial and economic growth in low-income countries. This is where you have institutions.
Rich countries that are saying we're not going to give you a loan for hydroelectric dams, or we're not going to support, carbon-intensive energy projects in countries that desperately need economic growth.
Precisely. We're going to explicitly ban foreign direct investment in hydroelectric dams, in nuclear power plants, in natural gas plants, in fertilizer production. We're going to ban the import of genetically modified and inorganic food production from poor countries. So you're sort of disallowing these places that already are not well resourced, either financially or in terms of technological or infrastructural or human capital. You're pulling up the ladder behind them while we continue to consume sort of world historic rates of fossil fuels and have sort of supermarkets blessed with the highest levels of food abundance that one could imagine. We are in our policies telling poor countries in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Latin America that we will not help them sort of build their own industrial, sort of modern industrial societies. And in many cases, we will actively sort of prevent the sort of use of modern technologies, even though the sort of benefit of being able to use synthetic fertilizer, for instance, in agricultural systems, far outweighs the cost of the climate emissions that would come from that fertilizer production.
The Biden administration has really embraced climate as an organizing principle for its approach to the American economy. The Inflation Reduction Act represents a massive, massive expenditure that is aimed at reshaping the American energy economy. I'm curious about your perspective as an eco-modernist, as someone who's thought very deeply about these issues. What would you do differently than the Biden administration and its allies in Congress when it comes to advancing the kind of environmental and climate policy goals that you think we ought to be pursuing?
My colleague Ted Nordhaus and I just wrote far too many words on that exact subject. If your listeners are interested, they can find it on www.thebreakthrough.org on the Biden administration's climate and economic agenda, which includes the sort of climate milestone, the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the Infrastructure Innovation and Jobs Act, the CHIPS Semiconductor Act, and a couple of other sort of quote unquote new industrial policy pieces of legislation. I think these represent sort of real progress in the sort of long-term sort of policy debate about addressing climate change. The Inflation Reduction Act is mostly a bunch of sort of subsidies and grant programs and investments in low carbon technology and in low carbon infrastructure. And that is at a high level exactly the way that we should be thinking about reducing emissions and addressing climate change, not by sort of regulating carbon emissions out of the atmosphere, primarily not about sort of cutting back or becoming less technological, but by accelerating the sort of wave of innovation that is represented by low carbon technologies. That said, there are extremes and pitfalls, I suppose I would point to in a technologically focused environmental politics. One that I think we do see in the Inflation Reduction Act is a over-subsidization of largely mature technologies. So most of the funding that is expected to come from the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act go towards solar panels and onshore wind turbines. These are technologies that the industries and environmentalists have been telling us for almost a decade are economic and competitive and subsidy independent. And yet, as soon as there is sort of a moment in Congress to do so, they not only extend the subsidies for these mature technologies, but they expand them greatly. And that's real money that our government is spending that has obviously long-term impacts on the national debt. But more than anything, I think could be spent on the remaining sort of technological solution set that is not as mature as wind and solar and lithium-ion batteries for our electric vehicles, and that includes things like next-generation nuclear reactors and alum cycle integrated carbon capture natural gas plants and electrolyzers for green hydrogen production, and a bunch of solutions for low carbon fertilizer and proteins and precision agriculture in the sort of farming space. Most of the solutions and most of the sort of emissions today in the world are caused by technologies for which we do not have good low carbon alternatives. So I would rather see more public investment in the earlier stage, sort of less proven, less developed technologies than in the most mature ones. The second thing I would say is that we are sort of subsidizing our favorite technologies with one hand, while making it harder to build those very systems and technologies with the other. And by this I mean that we're providing tax credits and grant programs for solar panels and for hydrogen production and even for nuclear reactors, while maintaining a overly burdensome system of siting, permitting, and sort of environmental regulation to actually deploy these technologies. So I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal before we talked that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed over a year ago, but the actual contracts for megawatts of clean energy in that year have declined by 50%. And this is what I hear when I talk to clean energy developers is that it remains extremely difficult to build projects in America, and you hear this not just in clean energy, but for projects like highways, and especially for housing and transit systems. We've made it incredibly difficult to build projects, to site and to permit and to contract and to construct projects in the United States. And the same environmental movement that it has lobbied for tax credits for their favorite technologies is now lobbying to sustain a sort of web of regulations and systems that slow the siting, permitting, and construction of the transmission lines and the pipelines and the roads and the charging infrastructure that will be required to actually build a low carbon economy. There's interest in changing those sort of rules from the Biden administration, from certainly from Republicans in Congress, but also from plenty of Democrats. But there is far from consensus on that matter. And in many ways, the sort of modern environmental movement is the biggest opponent to permitting reform and sort of reforms to the environmental regulations that are going to make it difficult to build abundant housing agricultural and energy infrastructure in the coming decades.
Alex, at the risk of oversimplifying, if you had it in your power, you as an eco-modernist, to just draft an entirely new version of the Inflation Reduction Act, would you say spend much less and focus on permitting reform more?
Absolutely. I mean, in sort of less abstract terms, what I might have done is I would have included maybe a little bit more infrastructure spending and even sort of clean energy subsidies in the Infrastructure, Innovation, and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that was passed in fall of 2021 on a bipartisan basis. I would have maybe made that bill a little bit bigger, targeted more subsidies towards earlier stage technologies like advanced reactors and like hydrogen electrolyzers and like carbon removal. And in that bipartisan setting, I would have passed more reforms to NEPA, to the Endangered Species Act, to the Clean Water Act, in ways that would make it easier to deploy the sort of infrastructure that has become the sort of principal bottleneck on actually building low carbon technology. So that is what I sort of wish had happened, both in a sort of abstract and in a sort of realpolitik sense.
I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about climate engineering and adaptation. You've touched on them briefly, but it does seem as though, if you believe that climate change is baked in, it does seem as though it would be sensible to invest in various ways to make our societies more resilient. But it also seems as though there's a resistance. Similarly, when you're thinking about solar radiation management, other interventions that could mitigate some of the effects of climate change, there just seems to be an almost religious resistance to these ideas, as though you're kind of making too much of a concession to kind of our desire for affluence and growth. Talk to me a bit about your perspective on those issues.
I think you're absolutely right that sort of pretty, sort of hardcore climate catastrophists will describe adaptation as a kind of moral hazard, that you're sort of pretending that you can solve a problem by adapting to it when really you have to prevent the problem in the first place. And by sort of investing in adaptation, for instance, sort of developing drought-resistant crops or building dikes and seawalls to confront sea level rise, you are making excuses for the problem in the first place, and you're extending the lifespan of the fossil fuel industry. That's the sort of classic moral hazard argument. I worry a little bit less about that because, for instance, the sort of Innovation, Infrastructure, and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act provide public funds for increasing adaptive capacity for things like seawalls. We are actually increasing investments in sort of biotech crops that are more resistant to drought and to sort of increased sort of new biological pests. So those arguments exist in the discourse. At the same time, like we were talking about a little bit earlier, we are adapting to the danger of living on planet Earth. And we are investing more in those types of adaptations. It will be, something of a race. And again, I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. We are reducing emissions and we are continuing to sort of buffer ourselves against climatic risk at the same time. On geoengineering, on the idea of, for instance, sort of regularly shooting sulfites up into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight, slow the rate of warming or even halt it. I'm not remotely opposed to. I'm strongly in favor of sort of research towards solar geoengineering, as it's called, and even sort of at least abstractly supportive of practical deployment of these technologies to slow the rate of warming. I don't anticipate it happening at a sort of large scale in any way that would say measurably reduce the atmospheric temperature by 1/10 of a degree or two, which is about how much the temperature has risen over the last 15 or 20 years. Precisely because it's not a threshold problem. Again, I don't think that there's ever going to really be a break glass in case of emergency and start spraying sulfites into the atmosphere moment. I don't think that there's going to be a sort of mega storm that finally convinces everyone really that climate change is a threshold problem, and we are at the precipice, and therefore we need to rapidly deploy this again sort of break glass a case of emergency solution. I think that the sort of global politics of deploying solar geoengineering at scale are far too sort of messy and sticky to ever reach agreement on who sets the temperature, what set of institutions is responsible for managing what would be thousands of airplanes flying around spraying sulfur into the atmosphere constantly. It's a small endeavor compared to, for instance, completely replacing every factory car and road and train in America or in the world. But it is a large technological endeavor. And I just when I really think about it, I don't really see us getting there. We've had megastorms. We saw the sort of horrifying floods in Pakistan last year, and I sort of was radicalized into caring about climate change by Hurricane Katrina. All of these might make us care more and might make us more motivated to deal with the climate problem, but I have a hard time imagining any sort of event or even a year of events or a summer like the one that we've had, where it was really, really hot. I have a hard time imagining that sort of motivating this big global concerted push towards geoengineering at scale, I suppose is what I would say.
Can you talk to us for a moment about nuclear power? There is a strong connection between the eco-modernist sensibility and support for nuclear power, and nuclear power is also an issue that unites some people on the political right and left. And yet there are considerable barriers to the further adoption of nuclear power. If anything, when you're looking across the affluent developed world, there is still a very vigorous push to shut down existing nuclear power plants. So I wonder if you could talk to us about the state of play there, particularly in the United States.
Yeah, so just to reiterate for your listeners, nuclear energy produces electricity with the smallest land and materials footprint that we have in our sort of tool belt. It produces zero carbon electricity. There is zero carbon emissions or air pollution or water pollution coming out of these power plants. What you do have produced by nuclear power plants is usually warm water that you have to release either into an ocean or into a river, which can have sort of hyperlocal effects and uses water, but I think is very hard to classify as pollution in any sense. And then you do have highly radioactive spent fuel in the reactors that you have to cool in pools and then in concrete casks for decades, and you have to manage that. I think any sort of sober analysis of those impacts compared to the sort of land area impact of other energy technologies or the air and water pollution of fossil fuels would lend towards a sort of favorable view towards nuclear energy. What you have to remember is that in many ways, the modern environmental movement was founded to oppose nuclear energy specifically. The Union of Concerned Scientists was concerned about radioactive materials from bombs and from power plants. That's what they're concerned about. That's what the Union of Concerned Scientists is like specifically concerned about when they're founded. Friends of the Earth broke off from the Sierra Club specifically to oppose the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant on the central coast of California, when members of the Sierra Club board in the 1950s and 1960s still, some of them were still pro-nuclear. So this specific technology, again, for a reason we talked about at the top, you're talking about this fundamental break with how we imagine humans interacting with nature or Gaia or whatever. You have this sort of fundamental change introduced by nuclear energy, and the modern environmental movement, in addition to opposing industrial agriculture and synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants, was specifically opposed to this technology. And those sort of environmentalist imaginary concepts remain with us today, both in our in the sort of cognitive and cultural ways we talk about environmental sustainability and harmony with nature, to which things like nuclear power and big cities and industrial agriculture are sort of definitionally opposed, but also in our laws and in our institutions. So, in over the sort of 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we created sort of regulatory apparatuses, like we were talking about earlier with our siting and permitting procedures. We created regulatory apparatuses, mostly within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that make it incredibly difficult to actually license and build nuclear power plants in this country. And we've exported many of those sort of procedural and legal frameworks around the world to other countries. Which is not the only reason, but is a core reason for why nuclear power plants remain expensive today, is because we radically overregulate radiological risk from these plants compared to any empirical assessment of the public health or epidemiological risk that we observe in the record of nuclear power plant operation. And we have a sort of activist public interest movement that is sort of very well resourced in the sort of environmental movement that is actively opposed, certainly to building new reactors or making it easier to license small advanced reactors, but also, as you say, actively working to shut down the single biggest source of low carbon electricity in the United States today, which is our 60 or so nuclear power plants.
I wonder, do you see the cultural context, the political context around nuclear power changing? Do you believe that, 10, 15, 20 years hence, we will see the advent of a nuclear revival? Or do you think that might be too much to hope for?
It better not be too much to hope for, because that's exactly what we're working on at Breakthrough. I do think you see a shift away from either hard, concerted, or default anti-nuclearism in the United States. We reviewed the sort of public opinion and cultural cognition literature on nuclear energy, and a couple years ago, one of our main findings is that most people don't think about nuclear at all. They might have a sort of reflexive opposition to it. But for instance, when you ask people if they're in favor or opposed to nuclear nuclear energy, they're mostly opposed. When you ask, are you in favor or opposed to nuclear energy for electricity generation? It's about a 20-point gap, a 20-point increase in across surveys in the level of support for nuclear electricity. So these are weak opinions loosely held by the public at large about nuclear, largely following elite cues. And the elite consensus on nuclear energy has shifted substantially over the last decade, during which the Breakthrough Institute has been working on nuclear in a sort of focused way. You have sort of a bipartisan consensus in Congress in the United States, plenty of Democrats, but also Republicans who are designing and passing policy to support nuclear energy. You have a sort of grassroots movement in support of nuclear power plants, both sort of in general and specific organizers who are showing up to sort of state water boards and to planning commissions in favor of keeping these plants operating. I think a sort of big moment of clarity came after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a bunch of European nations all of a sudden became very concerned about their energy security and their overdependence on natural gas pipelines from Russia and from outside the continent. And you had a quick re-scrambling of long planned efforts to shut down a bunch of nuclear power plants on the European continent. And I think that whether they consider themselves eco-modernists or not, you have a new generation of environmentalists, literally a new generation, who have neither the sort of memory of the anti-consumerism, anti-industrial environmental ethos that predominated in the 60s and 70s, nor the same sort of associations with sort of radiological risk and conflation of nuclear weapons with nuclear power plants that conventional environmentalists had. So you have this sort of climate-concerned, abundance-oriented set of environmentalists for whom nuclear energy is a sort of obvious solution, and they are facing the same problems that we at Breakthrough are, which is the legacies of a sort of public interest environmentalism and the legacies of overregulated nuclear technologies from decades ago. And we are, so we're actively working on sort of all those fronts, on the sort of cultural side, and on the policy side, to try and usher in this sort of nuclear renaissance that we have been needing for a long time.
One of the objections you'll hear from critics of nuclear is that it is just staggeringly expensive. But of course, some of that cost stems from the fact that you run such intense litigation risk. There is such intense determined opposition. So it seems a bit circular. I'm wondering if you were advising the Biden administration, its allies in Congress, about how to break that logjam and see to it that next generation nuclear can gain a foothold. Are there 2 or 3 policies that you would push for in the present?
Yeah, the first is that we really do have to change the way we regulate radiological risk within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which now regulates the possibility of sort of a radiation leak in a nuclear power plant. Down to the point where it's almost impossible to achieve from an engineering standpoint, and sort of low levels of radiological exposure from a sort of 3-mile island like partial meltdown are just not as dangerous as they are assumed to be by a sort of a epidemiological regulatory apparatus that does allow for the presence of other pollutants in sort of below certain standards. So we don't sort of regulate either ozone or certainly carbon emissions or other sort of public health hazards to zero in most contexts. We do that with radiation, and the evidence for that is very thin, at least. So we need to sort of change the regulatory procedures for how we deal with radiation. And the other thing, which, again, we're already doing thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act and thanks to a bunch of bills passed during the Trump administration, is invest in a next generation of smaller advanced nuclear reactors that both are literally smaller, sometimes 100th or 1,000th the size of the reactors that are currently operating commercially in the United States, but also use in many cases, different fuels and different fuel cycles. So there's sort of reactor designs today that don't use water as a coolant, but you use metals or salts or gases as a coolant, and that allows them to be smaller and meltdown proof. So those we need to in addition to sort of subsidies for those policies and grants and demonstration programs, we need reform to be able to license those reactors, which again the sort of stasis of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is obstructing right now. Because what we have to remember is nuclear power plants are, in addition to the sort of ways in which we overregulate them, they're expensive because they're huge industrial mega projects. They're expensive for the same reason the Second Avenue subway and the Big Dig and the Bay Bridge and the California high-speed rail are expensive. They, especially in the United States, unlike in some other countries like France and Korea and India, even the power plants we have were mostly one-off reactor and one-off engineering designs, sort of done in many places around the country. So there wasn't really... As
opposed to an assembly line approach where you have an approved design and you just crank out a ton of them and you get better and better at making them over time.
Exactly, which is obviously going to be something like, that learning by doing and economies of scale is obviously a benefit you're going to get from a car or from a solar panel or a wind turbine or a battery. But it's even something that large sort of industrial scale technologies can benefit from. Combined cycle natural gas turbines have only been around for several decades, and those are sort of largely manufactured as opposed to constructed on site. And so you see learning in sort of big machinery, in turbines, in boilers, in fermenters, And when you talk about, a boiler or a turbine, you're talking about something roughly the size of an advanced microreactor or an advanced small reactor. And so in addition to dealing with the sort of overregulation and confronting the sort of perverse public interest incentives against nuclear energy, we're really focused on these sort of next generation reactor and power plant designs that we think can benefit from the kinds of learning by doing and economies of scale that we see in other sectors of the economy.
Alex, I wonder if we could close on a political note. Over the last decade and a half, there have been a number of cultural controversies that have erupted that have had a political valence. Think about the fight over incandescent light bulbs and whether or not they ought to be banned. The recent battle over gas stoves and whether or not they should be phased out because of indoor air pollution and perhaps also climate considerations. And then, of course, electric vehicles, which you touched on earlier on. There's a real sense that these are very expensive. These are not responsive to the needs of many Americans, and also their environmental benefits are dubious. So you have this kind of weird right-left culture war over a lot of these technologies that are meant to have some climate benefit, that are championed by progressives, yet many other people see them as almost an attack on their lifestyle and the idea that they want to achieve a certain level of affluence. They see these technologies as enabling opportunity, making their lives better. I'm curious, for you as someone who's trying to reconcile folks on the left and right, trying to kind of unify people around a kind of eco-modernist perspective, how do you think about those controversies and where we go from here?
I think the sort of climate left leans a little too aggressively into some of these specific techno-based culture wars. Start with light bulbs. The Obama administration especially started phasing in standards to move sort of U.S. light bulb, both manufacture and use, away from incandescence, first towards compact fluorescence, and then ultimately towards halogen and LED light bulbs. And people were upset about this because, especially you imagine 15 years ago, the sort of swirly CFL light bulbs were very bright white and very harsh. And it wasn't insane or irrational for people who were used to sort of bright, warm, yellow incandescent light to be upset that these standards were being phased in to require the use of this sort of much less appealing light, of which they would have, dozens or more in their household. And sort of environmentalists and climate hawks were overwhelmingly dismissive and in fact, insulting of those concerns. I think the light bulb saga, if anything, despite all that, is one we should emulate, because these were standards that were phased in slowly over more than a decade, and that gave sort of light bulb engineers and manufacturers plenty of time both to create warmer CFLs, but ultimately to sort of invent and scale up LEDs, which are much more efficient than even CFLs are, and have much better sort of color control. So now we have really, really efficient light bulbs that come in the kinds of colors you want and look like incandescent light bulbs in ways that are sort of more sort of amenable for most consumers. So the bottom line is that as we sort of phase in new low carbon technologies, both on the production and especially on the consumption side, these have to be affordable and they have to be desirable to consumers. And what I worry about with some of the advocacy around things like induction stoves is that we're both talking about sort of regulatory mandates for to replace traditional gas stoves with electric induction stoves before we actually have sufficient supply of induction stoves or sufficient supply of electricians to install them, or before they're affordable. A typical induction stove is something like twice as expensive as a good gas stove, and we at least have to close that price disparity considerably before we start talking about mandating them. But then I do think that especially at this stage, when advocates realize that there's too few electricians and there's there's too few induction stoves, and we need to sort of motivate consumers to want induction stoves sort of organically. They start just telling lies about the actual sort of costs and risks of having the fossil fuel technology, about having the gas stove. So you, over the last couple of years, you've seen, not really coming out of the epidemiological community or out of academia, but you're starting to see a lot of peer-reviewed papers coming out, sort of authored by advocacy organizations like the Rocky Mountain Institute or Electrify America that are I looked into this, absolutely misrepresenting the epidemiological risks of having a gas stove in your house and claiming that it's the sort of a central cause of child's asthma in America today. And that having a gas stove in your household is like pumping car exhaust in through a window. I looked into this, and it's just not true. Most of the public health effects associated with cooking overwhelmingly come from the food and the fat that you're cooking with, the oil and the food, not from the fuel. And I think people know when they are sort of being misled and being talked down to, certainly. And I think people sense when there's a kind of scaremongering about their lifestyles going on. And I think I think that sort of explains why induction stoves, which are very cool, are likely the future, are coming anyway. That's because of the way that sort of advocates talk about gas versus induction and the ways that they sort of bend and distort the public health science on the question. I think it creates a culture where there needn't be one, and I find that depressing.
Do you see some areas where you can envision left-right cooperation on energy policy? Anything that you're enthusiastic about? Anything that you're hopeful about?
We've talked about a lot of it. There are sort of bipartisan coalitions working on permitting reform right now, on reforms to NEPA, a little bit trickier reforms to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which regulates electric power transmission, high voltage transmission lines in the United States. But there's lots of work happening in those areas. There's sort of bipartisan work happening on, again, advanced nuclear reactors, and in particular right now, regulatory reform at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, reforms that started during the Trump administration and which continue into the Biden administration. And it's fuzzier to me, but I can say for sure that there is a lot of interest on both sides of the aisle in whether and how we will develop critical minerals production, sort of mining for lithium and for silicon and for cobalt and for graphite and for lead and for uranium in the sort of continental United States, and lots of bipartisan concern for if and when we don't get all of our sort of natural resources from within the continental United States, where we're getting it otherwise. So, very strong bipartisan interest in sort of friend-shoring supply chains, preferably sort of outside of China. I say fuzzier because that is a huge challenge and will be as the sort of material footprint of decarbonization becomes ever more obvious. We're already seeing sort of supply chain bottlenecks with things like lithium and silicon and rare earth metals. But it's certainly an area where there is less sort of reflexive polarization on the subject compared to something like subsidies for solar panels or sort of certainly compared to things like regulations on carbon emissions. So I think there's
fair to say you're feeling optimistic.
Yes, I am feeling optimistic. We, emissions are trending down in the United States and in most wealthy countries around the world. I think we have a sort of bumpy few years ahead of us in the sort of wake of the COVID pandemic and the response to it, and the sort of supply chain shocks to commodities, not just sort of lithium and electric vehicles, but also sort of cereals and grains that we're still sort of suffering the downwind effects from after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in the long term, I see lots of encouraging cost curves for hydrogen electrolyzers. And I see lots of startups working on low carbon alternatives to carbon intensive fertilizer production. We're getting more and more excited about this next generation of advanced reactors. I see, again, bipartisan interest in working on permitting reform and critical minerals siting and development. So there's plenty of work to do. And I suppose it would be remiss of me not to repeat that I am optimistic because I don't really think that there is such a thing as too late. Faster is better than slower, and less warming is better than more warming. But it's and so for us, I think it's about sort of direction of travel. Are we making smart investments in sort of a techno-inclusive set of low carbon technologies? And the answer is yes. Are emissions declining in the wealthy world? Are we becoming more resource efficient? And the answer is yes. It might not be happening at a pace sort of that comports with so radical change to every aspect of society by 2030 or before 450 parts per million or something. But if you get out of that sort of catastrophist threshold understanding of climate risk, then there's quite a bit to be optimistic about.
Thanks very much, Alex.
Thanks for having me, Reihan.
Listeners, if you like what you heard, please feel free to write a review wherever you listen, and be sure to tune in to future episodes of Manhattan Insights. I'm your host, Reihan Salam.